Welcome, viewers and listeners, to Island Vibes, a weekly podcast where we look at things Caribbean, the islands, the people, the culture, the politics, and way of life. Today, we will be looking at a few stories. We'll be looking at the debauch situation in Dominica, and we also saw news of Dominica supplying water to St Lucia. These two, among other stories, we will touch on this week's episode. Stay tuned, we'll be right back after this short break. This past week, news surfaced coming from St. Lucia, a few news outlets in St. Lucia, and from around the region likewise, on the story or the fact that St. Lucia is considering importing water from the island of Dominica. We heard from the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Philippe J. Concerning that arrangement, but residents of St. Lucia and Dominica, were a bit surprised hearing such news, as there was no official announcement coming from either administration of the respective islands prior to news surfacing from on the various news outlets. St. Lucians are therefore asking questions. Their primary concern is the long-term plan of the Philip J. administration to solving what is apparently a water crisis in St. Lucia, water shortage crisis. Among the questions, is the concerns or what the arrangements are between these two islands. They're questioning what the arrangements are, and they're seeking answers, which have not been made clear by the administrations of either island. St. Lucia and Dominica, for a number of years, a number of decades, have had this relationship, which is unlike that among the other OECS islands. They've had sort of a sister relationship. And so in their time of crisis, they turn to a sister island, which has an abundance of water, and that is Dominica. It is quite ironic, however, the fact that Dominica itself has had for a number of years its own issues with maintaining a regular water supply in a number of communities on the island. We know that the water company there has been undertaking projects in some communities, to sort of improve the water supply in those communities, but there are a number of communities in which said projects are not evident. Among those communities are Wallahouse and Shufford, for example, among others. And they've had water issues in both of those communities, among others, where for sometimes days in a week, residents would be without water, for the greater part of the day. And sometimes, a lot of times, coming from work, you would come home and there's no water, until probably midnight. And last February 2025, vacation in Dominica, I was, living in St. Lucia at the time, or staying in St. Lucia rather on my vacation. And for 2 straight days, the water had been gone for almost an entire day on both occasions, coming back past midnight. And I inquired from one of the employees, the water company there, Doasco, one of the employees responsible for having the water systems properly maintained. And I was told that after the water would have been turned back on, supposedly after the company would have been undertaking maintenance work, that the residents in the lower lying communities would use up most of the water. And so people at high altitudes like St Lucia would have an issue getting water. And that was compounded by the fact that there was also a cruise ship import that was also, resupplying its water storage from the water company in Dominica as well. So that sort of compounded the problem. Knowing the basic laws of physics, I kind of understood the explanation of, the lower altitude, the communities in the lower altitude using up the most of the water when it would be first turned back on. But then gone past midnight, when the water demand and the water usage would have, significantly been reduced, I would expect that whatever storage facilities that the water company has would have by that time, been filled, refilled, or replenished. That by the next morning, we would have regular water supply, but that wasn't the case in King Police. And I would imagine that, we grow up learning this whole adage that you first take care of your backyard before you can take care of anybody else. And while it is a noble gesture to help, a sister island or somebody else in need, I think it would be prudent to first take care of, the needs of your own residents who are paying customers who come home sometime after work and there's no water. I would think the prudent thing would be to first take care of that before you can offer help to somebody else. So it cannot be that you cannot regularly supply your own residents with water, but then you can supply somewhere else. And that's just my humble opinion. Helping a fellow sister island, I have absolutely no problem with that. But I would think, like they say, charity begins at home. And, taking care of the water needs of your own residents, I think, should be paramount and your primary interest, before you can offer help somewhere else. And so going forward, I do hope that both islands and the administrations on both islands and the water companies on both islands can find solutions to the water issues on both islands. St Lucia apparently having a water shortage crisis. Dominica, a crisis of maintaining a reliable water supply, not necessarily a water shortage, but maintaining a reliable water supply. So I would like to see that they get that fixed in Dominica, that they can, readily help, a sister island in St. Lucia. Welcome back. Earlier this week, we saw some, well, as a matter of fact, there's been ongoing protest action, silent protest, a handful of individuals for days on end have been visiting the debauch site of where the government of Dominica is intending to set up some quarry operation to, obtain material for, the construction of the international airport, the ongoing construction of the airport. There have been much protests and much reservations, much concerns raised over, what is happening in that area, the destruction of the natural environment, the pollution of the river, the destruction of agricultural lands, and how it affects and impacts the neighboring communities of Concord and the Kalinago territory. And for a number of days, in a couple of months now, we have seen few individuals, go there every day. One such individual is a reggae icon, Dominica's reggae legend, Nasio Fountain. He's been, relentlessly going there every day protesting what's happening in terms of the destruction of the environment there. We have seen environmentalists and we have seen concerned citizens, ecologists, espouse on the issue and, the impact of such operations on that island. It has been advanced that there are alternative sites where, material for the airport can be obtained instead of destroying that area. The other areas have already existing quarries where such material can be obtained. The argument advanced by the authorities is that the other sites are, like the distance of the other sites make it, highly expensive to transport material from these sites to the airport. And so they were looking at Debauch as a site much closer to the airport to obtain such material. But the thing is, what is happening in Debauch is not, they're first trying to clear out the land and then try to dig down into the earth to obtain such material. That has been ongoing for quite a while now, and they have yet to obtain any such material, like aggregate, the rocks that they need for aggregate for the construction of the airport. So while they are claiming that on one end it's expensive to transport aggregate from the other quarries, they are spending a lot of time and wasting a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of money, you know, excavating to obtain, you know, rocks to then run through a quarry operations to get aggregate. And a number of people had been suggesting that there was more to it going on there than just, you know, the authorities searching for, you know, material aggregate. A lot of people were thinking that, you know, it was a copper mining going to take place in that area, as in years past, studies have proven that there are copper deposits in that area. In fact, the previous administration had a proposal to do copper mining there, which was shut down because of protests from environmentalists and other Dominicans. And the same thing happened this time around, how many years later? More than 2 decades later. And people protested, you know, people raised concerns, and there was a stop order to the operations, and the operation stopped for a couple of days and then continued. And some people, you know, some believe it continued without, you know, you know, the authority of the government, that people are thinking that the Chinese are doing what they want in that area because the government had put a stop order to it. And then a couple of days later, we saw, you know, the contractors going right back working. And so this past week, we saw, you know, a scuffle between, you know, Nasio Fountain and the police authorities. Nasio was trying to stop one of the heavy equipment. I think it was a crane that they were trying to transport to that area. And we saw him being manhandled by the police. I mean, they politely asked him to, you know, to get out of the way of the vehicle, of the, you know, the heavy equipment. And he insisted, and he was manhandled for it.
Enforce the law. This is breaking the law, brother. This is breaking the law, brother. We don't want to have to do this. We want them to follow the law. We're asking them to follow the law. Not touching your brother. The only thing we want is the law to be followed. They're not following the law. Understand, brother? You put me in a situation where how should I act the police? Yes, because, sir, your job is to protect citizenry and constitution. Correct? This is a violation of law. So are you protecting the colonists or us, the citizens? Because this is the reality we live right now. This is breaking the law. You are forcing good law-abiding people to have to put their body on the line because they're breaking the law. 3 years they take my land, they don't pay me every day they own my land, trespassing. Nobody stopped them? Now there's a court order stopping them from doing this, and they're continuing. So is there law in the country, or is there only the Chinese colonizator? Because if it's only Chinese colonizator, what happens for your children, my children, this young man's children, his children, your children? No, brother. The law. The law. Yes, the Constitution is the law. So they enforce the law. Why don't you have to have it done? Why should you do that? They are breaking the law. 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 Hold on, hold on, hold on. They are breaking the law yesterday. Oi. Do not rough him up. Do not rough him up.
Relax. Just relax yourself.
You are a political, not a police.
Relax.
You are protecting politics, not
you have
law.
your family, you have your kids, just take it. Relax.
Your family, that's why we here, my brother. You have family, all of you are family. What's the matter?
Yes, Ministry of State Security. How are you, sir? Colonizator from the MSS, representing China. What about you representing Dominica?
That's easy.
So I hope going forward that, you know, common sense prevail, and you know, we start looking at things from, you know, an objective standpoint as opposed to party political loyalty and wanting to see the airport constructed at any cost. We all want the airport, but it shouldn't be at any cost. And this is what most who are opposed to what's happening in India Bush are talking about. So I hope that the discussions can continue and good sense, common sense will prevail on this issue. Just about 2 weeks ago, we had the UK imposing visa restrictions on the citizens of St Lucia for what they claim were one, the increase in asylum seekers from that island, from St Lucia, and two, issues surrounding the CIP program, there's a Citizenship by Investment program, both of which they claim pose risks for the UK and pose concerns for immigration authorities there. This past week, Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Philip J. Pierre, made it known that his administration did not intend on stopping the CIP program. In fact, he said, and I quote, "I will tell you that St. Lucia has no intention of stopping the CIP program. Just as the UK has authority to determine its immigration policies, St. Lucia has the sovereign right to pursue policies to support national development." To recap, Dominica to supply St. Lucia with water, but quite ironically, simultaneously, protest action is ongoing in Dominica to protect the very natural environment that has lent to the island being known for having an abundance of water. So I do hope that common sense can prevail. This brings us to the end of today's podcast. Until next week, do have a blessed day all.